أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's afternoon here, just about here in UK, in London, at a slightly earlier time than usual. Of course, we normally have the session at 4 o'clock. We're having it 4 hours a little bit earlier than usual. The main reason being is because our guest speaker is a Canadian living in Australia. And Australia is around about 8.5 to 9 hours ahead of the UK. We didn't want our guest speaker to be delivering his webinar at 2 a.m. in the morning. So here we are, alhamdulillah. Okay. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Nadeem Memon here with us to talk about redefining, in inverted commas, Islamic environment in Muslim schools. Redefining Islamic environment in Muslim schools. Let me introduce to you Dr. Nadeem Memon. MashaAllah, he's got an excellent background and very much qualified to talk about the topic this afternoon. Dr. Nadeem Memon is a senior research fellow in the Center of Islamic Thought and Education in the School of Education at the University of South Australia. His research focuses on teacher education with particular emphasis on Islamic pedagogy, comparative faith-based schooling, philosophy of religious education, and culturally relevant and responsive teaching. He is the co-editor of 2 books, Philosophies of Islamic Education, Historical Perspectives and Emerging Discourses, and also Discipline, Devotion and Dissent, Jewish, Catholic and Islamic Schooling in Canada. And perhaps you can talk a little about those 2 books a bit later on as well. Prior to joining the University of South Australia, Nadeem was the Director of Education at Razi Education, a Canadian educational consulting firm that develops professional development for educators working in Western schooling contexts with significant Muslim student populations, and for educators in Muslim majority contexts, Muslim countries, for example. At Razi Education, Nadeem spearheaded the design and implementation of a groundbreaking online teacher certificate program. Perhaps many of you enrolled on that program, which ran for many years. And that was called the Islamic Teacher Education Program in collaboration with the University of Toronto. In addition to the above, Dr. Nadeem has also held faculty teaching positions in a number of universities around the world, including Morocco and Canada. Nadeem holds a PhD in Theory and Policy Studies in Education from the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. His doctoral dissertation focused on the history and philosophy of Islamic schooling in North America. He holds an MA in Education with research focus on experiential education and a B.Ed of Education with specialisms in teaching high school English and history from York University in Toronto, Canada. Wow, mashallah, I'm almost out of breath listing all of the wonderful achievements by Dr. Nadeem Memon, mashallah. A real heavyweight. He's still very young, mashallah, but a real heavyweight, mashallah, in terms of what he's achieved and his knowledge. So we're really, really fortunate. I'm really excited, actually. As many of you know, I bought one of his books the other day, and I'm really excited that I've got the author of that book right in front of me. So inshallah, I hope you're as excited as I am. For those of you that have joined us for the first time, these weekly webinars, they normally take place at 4 p.m. British summertime. It's just today we've got it 4 hours earlier. So it's a weekly webinar where we're trying to increase your knowledge and understanding beyond the kind of pedagogy that we're used to, or the subject-specific pedagogy that we're used to, whether you teach maths or English or history or geography or whatever it may be. We want you to have a deeper understanding about some of the Islamic perspectives and have a real appreciation of the Islamic traditions as well. Okay, so the way that this webinar is structured is that Dr. Nadeem Memon will deliver his presentation, inshallah, for about half an hour to 35 minutes. And then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So you, the virtual audience, will have an opportunity to ask questions to Dr. Nadeem. And And inshallah, the way that you do that is by either raising your hand, there's a reaction button at the bottom, or you can write the word speak in the chat box. Okay, so if you write anything in the chat box, it comes to me, and then I will order those questions, inshallah. We are going to give preference to those that want to ask verbal questions rather than written questions. Okay, and we don't obviously have a huge amount of time, so we probably will get through a few questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't come around to answering your question. We would like to end at, I was going to say 5 o'clock, but obviously we're earlier today, so around about just after 1 o'clock, let's say, about 1:05. So if you've got anything else that you need to be doing or any appointments, etc., and you're wondering whether we're going to be going over time, no, we don't tend to go over time with these weekly webinars. So, all right, so that's the formal introduction, if you like. Let's go over to Dr. Nadeem. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Nadeem. How are you, first of all?
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well.
Now, it's a very British thing to ask what the weather is like. So I'm going to ask you, what is the weather like in Australia? Because over here, whilst we had a month of more sun in 1 month than I think since records began last month, this month seems to be a very wet month, unfortunately. And it's been raining all night, and it's very grey in your typical British weather, unfortunately. So what's it like in Australia?
Well, it's winter here, so I should say that it's winter. It's a bit cooler than it generally is, but I have to always compare things to the Canadian weather, and it's far more pleasant of a winter in Australia than it would be in Canada. I can say that much.
Wow, yes, the Canadian winters, we're talking -20, -15. Those are kind of unthinkable temperatures for us here in the UK. Okay, all right, let's get going, inshallah. I think over to you then, inshallah. Thank you first of all, thank you for joining us, inshallah, and we really look forward to your presentation, and then we'll have questions in around about half an hour or so, inshallah. Thank you.
The honor and pleasure is mine to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, particular because I've seen some of the previous webinars with the seminal speakers that you've had in the past couple of webinars. So I'm humbled to have been invited and part of this. And inshallah, there's some benefit in the session today for everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulil kareem. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. The session for the next 30 minutes or so will speak about this idea of redefining an Islamic environment in Muslim schools or Islamic schools. It wouldn't be fair for me to not acknowledge that we are living in a time, a very momentous time in our history, in our lives. And I think it's important to acknowledge the privilege that we have. I always remind not do justice to this moment that we live in by thinking about what renewal of our schools can mean. So I speak today with that in mind, with this being really a gift. I think this moment being a gift for Islamic schooling. Our scholars have said that in moments of calamity are gifts for the believers. And I hope and pray that inshallah, the moment that we're living through is a moment of renewal for our schools and a gift for our schools as a global sector, inshallah. The overarching question I think that drives my presentation this afternoon on your end and this evening on my end is what defines an Islamic school environment. I think just about every Islamic school website that I've ever seen or school that I visited, and I'm sure the same for you, is defined, its distinction is defined by the term an Islamic environment. When parents come to an Islamic school and say, why should I enroll my child in this particular school? Or when teachers look at the website and try to look at what makes this Islamic school distinct from another school, just about every Islamic school mentions somewhere in their philosophy, their vision, their mission, somewhere on their website or in their introductory manuals, it'll say something about how we offer an Islamic environment. And I'd like to unpack what we mean by, what we could mean by the term Islamic environment. And I intend to do that in two ways, in theory and practice. Theory, I think, is important for us because it helps us conceptualize and reconceptualize the way we think and to shift our thinking. And in terms of practice, I think just about every Islamic school educator, every educator is always looking for so what does this mean for my practice? What does this mean for my school? What does this mean for my classroom? So again, I think it would be a disservice on my part to just leave you with theory and not speak about what this means for our practice in schools. So in this session, in the theory, I'll be borrowing from the work of Abdullah Trevathan, who most of you are probably familiar with in the UK context because he's left mashallah, a legacy behind with the work that he's done with Muslim schools in the UK. But three particular chapters of his from 2016, 2018, and 2020 that I'll be drawing on and that I will highly recommend we all consider reading and reflecting on. So I'll share the references, inshallah, at the end. But two of the chapters, alhamdulillah, he's contributed to books that I've been able to co-edit and I think are very exciting. So I'll speak about the shift that he presents in the way we should think about character education and Islamic school environments and ethos. And then I'll share these practical examples of what this means for our classroom practice. Now, he says some interesting things at the beginning of one of his articles. I think it's the one in 2018, where he puts the context of, he says we have to acknowledge that our Islamic Muslim schools are in a particular context. We're in a context of educational leadership and educational, unfortunately, management that has fallen prey to the global management culture, where there's an overemphasis on managerialism, on efficiency, standardization, optimization, measurement, compliance, and it's all about how are we accountable for and prepared toward school inspections, school reviews, accreditation requirements, and the like. And this managerialism, he argues, has seeped into both education, in the way we run our schools, but also in terms of religion and how we foster an Islamic identity in our young people. So it's not just in the way we manage our schools, the way we lead our schools, but it's also in the way that we actually bring Islam into our schools, which is a really interesting argument, I feel, because I think for a long time we've been thinking, yes, this sense of managerialism has an impact on the way the way our school structures work. And there's been plenty of criticisms of Islamic schools being bland representation, reflections of public state schools. It's no more than an Islamic school is no more than a public school with Islam tacked on. And you hear a lot of this sort of criticism in the media, and you hear it in a lot of research that's out there. But he takes it a step further, and he says that even the way that we draw on our own faith tradition, our own religion within an Islamic school has also become, in many ways, fallen prey to this sense of managerialism. I'll explain what he means by that. He says, you can't quantify, or you shouldn't quantify, or don't quantify what is immeasurable. And he says, quote, in possessing a theology of an unquantifiable, indefinable, and limitless God, Allah, one would presume that Muslims would counter the human tendency to constantly quantify and codify, of which managerialism is an optimum example, a type of conceptual idolatry. So he says, almost to the point where, you know, we recognize as Muslims that Allah is unquantifiable, indefinable, limitless, and yet everything that we try to do within our Islamic schools, I shouldn't say everything, but much of what we're trying to do in our Islamic schools, especially when it comes to an Islamic schooling environment, has to be quantified, codified, and measured in line with sort of the educational trends of the day. And then he starts speaking about this idea of ethos, environment, ethos of an Islamic school. And as I mentioned, in most cases, we would define or we would explain that the distinction of our Islamic school is its Islamic environment. But he says, have we sufficiently defined it? And then he says, an inauthentic ethos increases alienation of staff and students. And that was really powerful for me, because in all of my time researching and visiting Islamic schools, really, alhamdulillah, I've had the chance to visit schools globally. I find that there's a lot of consistency in terms of the challenges that we're facing in our Islamic schools. And a lot of it has to do with this sense of alienation, where staff and students feel, in some cases, I shouldn't say in all cases, but in some cases, staff and students begin to feel alienated from the very purpose of that Islamic schools were established for. And if an Islamic school is established for, and Dr. Abdullah Shahin spoke deeply in the previous webinar, in one of the previous webinars about tarbiyah, if Islamic schools have been established with this essence of tarbiyah in mind, and Dr. Farah Ahmed spoke recently about the Adamic nature and Hadith Jibreel, both of which really give us a sense of why Islamic schools exist. Now, if that's why Islamic schools have existed, and staff and students don't feel connected to that sense of tarbiyah that's essential to an Islamic school fabric, the social fabric, then there's something missing. So he defines ethos in two views. And this is where it begins to, hopefully the conceptualization you'll start seeing the connections here. He says that there's two views. There's a positivist view where ethos is stipulated by right and wrong, i.e. in religious schools, we attempt to preserve the values by virtue of look out for infringements, which require school policies and regulations. So, for example, we say the purpose of our Islamic school is to foster tarbiyah. Sure. And then to foster tarbiyah, we're going to have these policies on what appropriate behavior looks like. And then we're going to measure this appropriate behavior by telling students, this is your list of what's acceptable, and this is what's your list of what's unacceptable. And we're going to keep looking for, almost policing, these unacceptable behaviors. So it's almost taking the positivist view of an ethos is when you stipulate the right and wrong and you limit it to almost like a checklist of the do's and don'ts. The non-positivist view is where ethos is not managed or imposed, at least not directly, but arises naturally through social interaction, woven into the social fabric of the institution. Now, I'll tell you this, for those of us who've had the opportunity to visit other schools, and you've had a chance to walk into other schools, state, public, private, independent, Islamic or not, but you've walked into another school, and sometimes, when you walk into that school and you feel something, like you just walk through the front entrance and you feel something different. You can feel it in the social fabric. You can feel it in the vibe, what Abdullah Trevathan calls the vibe or the feel of the school. Students are sort of just, they sort of know where to go. People are polite. There's this culture, this adab, this etiquette of just, everything is just seamless. And you don't see anyone reprimanding anyone else. And it's not about rules and regulations and checklists, but it's more about the vibe. How does that happen? And that's sort of what he's getting at when he's saying that there's one view of sort of the right and wrong checklist policing approach, and there's the non-positivist view of it's naturally sort of part of the vibe of the school, and that ethos in itself comes in a certain way. And he speaks about how this would come, inshallah. We'll get to it. He says the danger of mandating what is immeasurable, the danger in imposing and establishing a formal school ethos is that it is so easily prone to being relegated as a set of rhetorical ideals set up by the institution. The greater the gap between the everyday reality and the prescribed ought to be, the greater the risk of the latter being perceived as an artificial and pontifical by an increasingly cynical student or staff body, i.e., you know this, and again, you can probably relate to this, but you know how when you set up a lot of rules and a lot of policies, what do students and staff end up looking for? They start looking for contradictions. They spend more time looking for the contradictions in other people's behavior. Well, you told me yesterday I should be like this, and now look at what you're doing. Or the principal said this, the head of school said this, and now look at what they're doing. And it's always like you get consumed. Everybody starts getting consumed in it's a cynical nature that starts getting consumed in almost looking for other people's contradictions rather than focusing on yourself. And that what he's trying to say in this, what I gathered from this article, the 2018 article in particular, is that when you impose this sense of prescriptive approach to an environment, to an Islamic schooling environment, or as Dr. Abdullah mentioned in the previous webinar, when you make something like tarbiyah, which is really not something that should be, it's not really a tangible, it's not really quantifiable, and you quantify it, the adverse effect happens than what you had intended. So then he redefines, Abdullah Travisan redefines ethos. He says the quality and characteristics of the unique ambiance, social interaction, cultural overviews, practice, and ritual within an organization. That's what an ethos is. An ethos is the quality of an ambiance, of the social interaction, the quality, not the quantity. As I mentioned, when you walk into a school and you just have that feeling, that vibe, you can't describe it, you just know, right? I remember walking to some schools, it doesn't matter where the school is, but you walk into certain schools and you just have this feeling. It's just the environment, the way the classrooms are set up, the way the rooms are set up, the way the spacing of the school is, the way you walk in, the way you're received. I mean, it goes on, but it's the ambiance of it. Ethos ought to be, he says, about the in moment between teacher and student, not static, operating at multiple levels and a lived reality, intentive rather than prescriptive. Intentive rather than prescriptive. And I found this to be really powerful because we know in the Islamic tradition, there's such an emphasis on intention. There's such an emphasis on our niyyah and what we bring to our schools, what we bring to our classrooms, the niyyah that we have in the interaction with our learners. And yet we're not encouraged enough, I would argue, we're not encouraged enough in our Islamic schools to reflect on the niyyah we have every single day in every single interaction. Because if we really took ourselves to task, if there was really a sense of muhasaba, self-reflection, muraqaba, of self-correctingness within our own selves about our interactions with students, we would constantly be asking ourselves, yeah, that probably wasn't the right. I wasn't thinking the right thing in my mind when I spoke with that student. I actually had a deficit way of thinking about it. When that student handed in their work, when that student walked into the classroom, I had a preconceived notion of what they're capable of. Our intention would correct us constantly if that was part of the ethos of our school. So he says, now this is getting toward the practical bit. He says we need to look at ethos in two ways: the maximalist and the minimalist approaches. The maximalist approach, he says, has to be looking at ethos from a school philosophical perspective. Why, what, how do we define the pedagogy, the teaching, the trust over compliance of our school? It's based on high quality outcomes, but it's really a defining of the distinctive philosophy of our school, answering these big questions. And the minimalist is about the individual interactions, the teacher self-awareness, like I mentioned with Nia, the personal integrity that we bring to our conversations, the heightened awareness of our social interaction with the staff, the greater sense of presence, authenticity, listening, genuine respect for children, and upholding of the dignity of the learner. We know, for example, if you're going to reprimand a child, if you're going to, hold a child to task for something they did, we can't, it's not in our tradition to belittle a child in a way that takes away their dignity. And yet so many approaches to behavior management, at least that are not, maybe not in principle, but in practice, often reflect something that takes away the dignity of the child. We reprimand children in front of their peers. We reprimand children in public. We know that if we did something wrong, we wouldn't want to be exposed. And yet we expose the errors and the mistakes and the misgivings and the shortcomings of our learners constantly. So anyways, the maximalist and minimalist approaches, will come back to this, inshallah. He then says, we need to also look at the difference between outward and inward sunnah, the outward and inward sunnan. And he says, look, when we talk about an Islamic schooling environment, we often talk about the outward, the salah, the way we dress, the dress code, the appropriate behavior, the greetings of salam, the things we put on the walls. And, you know, you often say, our Islamic school will have an Islamic school, the ethos will be Islamic. There'll be ayat of the Quran on the walls, and there'll be people giving salam, and we'll make dua in the morning and dua at the end of the day, and so on and so forth. That's the outward sunnah. And then he says there's the inward sunnah of being courteous to others and caring and being resilient and aspirational, etc. And then he asks the question about the inward. He says, but aren't these what all schools claim? And he says, we would expect a Muslim school to have some or all of these things anyways. But how is this different from stating that an academic school ethos is evident in that it has desks and chairs? I.e., I actually, when I read this for the first time, I actually laughed out loud, because it's so evident that oftentimes we tell parents, come to our Islamic school, we have an Islamic school ethos. And the parent says, well, what do you mean by Islamic school ethos? What do you mean Islamic school environment? And they say, oh, we pray salah. And I would say to myself, but shouldn't you pray salah anyways? Oh, we have, you know, an Islamic dress code. Shouldn't you have a dress code? I mean, shouldn't we dress in a way that's humble and you know, aligned with our tradition? We say salam to, well, I'm glad you're saying salam to people, but you're stating the obvious. And I think what he's trying to say here is, it's like saying, you know, my school is committed to academic success, and we've got whiteboards and smart boards and desks and chairs, and it's stating the obvious. So he says, he proposes something different. And he says, and this is where I think it really hit and struck me. He says, what if humility is a characteristic of the school, a defining characteristic of our school? And he says, humility is something that is part and parcel of our tradition. And he speaks about this at length in the chapter, but I haven't elaborated here. But he says humility, obviously, you know, in the character of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, an essential characteristic of our Prophet is and was humility. And it's this utter sort of understanding that Allah is at one point, Allah is limitless and intangible, and yet Allah is as close to us as our jugular vein. It's this, he talks about how, you know, you have this sense of humility that, like, I can't see Allah, but yet Allah is so close to us. And you're constantly in this sense of reflection. Now he says, what if we fostered for children and students and learners in our schools an ethos of humility that was the grounding philosophy of our schools? And he says humility, if anything, flies in the face of academic excellence and achievement, because you're no longer boasting about your academic achievement. You're no longer putting up posters and flyers and marketing ads about how well, you know, a handful of our students are doing. It's not about boasting. It's about acknowledging that even success comes from Allah, and success comes to each of us in very different ways. Humility, he says, is a sign of weakness in our global youth culture, and yet revered in Islam. So amongst young people, it's all about showing each other, you know, how confident they are, and giving a sense of almost, you know, of overconfidence. And yet in Islam, it's about how you humble yourself. It's the opposite. The opposite is pride, self-admiration, which is not inherently negative unless one seeks it, and it effectively penetrates the very core of the human struggle, i.e., the struggle against our nafs. So he questions, what if, aside from all of the other stuff, the outward and the inward sunnah that we mentioned, but what if humility was that characteristic, that overarching characteristic of our schools? And then he speaks about the concept of Hudür. And he says, essential to this sense of humility especially from a perspective of us as educators, is this concept of Hudür, of spiritual presence and awareness. And he says this also in many ways flies in the face of the sort of educational normative conventional trends of the day, because heedlessness and distraction are commonplace amongst our students. Self-absorption, stress, anxiety, lack of concentration, inability to be in the moment, even for us as teachers, even for us as parents. I often find, even when I'm sitting with my own child at home, he's 4, and the first moment I get is I'm opening my phone, checking my WhatsApp, checking messages, and I'm not in the moment. And similarly for us as educators, oftentimes when we're sitting there with students, we're not in the moment. We're either thinking about what we have to do after class, we're thinking about what the next activity is going to be, we're thinking about the things that are piling up, but we're not in the moment enough to be listening to students at a very deep level. So we're easily drawn into the facade of things, disconnected from the world around us generally. And these contemporary levels of distraction call for an urgent action in cultivating Hudür among students and ourselves before any significant imparting of akhlaq can take place. And I think this is the critical piece here, that if we're going to speak about humility, we're going to speak about, like I mentioned, the essence of an Islamic schooling environment is, like we mentioned, to foster tarbiyah. Why? For the sense of akhlaq, for adab, for ta'adib, for this sense of etiquette, of being, of wholeness. But how can you do that if we're not even present? And that's the big question. How do you do this if you're not even present? And if you're not even spiritually in the moment present? And again, this needs to be something that's central for us as educators. If we're not present, how can we expect our students to be present? Now what? So I've got a few minutes left. I know I was told to end in 30 minutes. I'm going to end in a few more, but let me give you the now what. So you're thinking, okay, we got the theory, great. Let me return to this concept of maximalist and minimalist ethos, okay? The school philosophy and the classroom-based engagement. So I'll try to give you a few practical reflections on what this could mean for us as educators in our schools. For the maximalist, on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of one of his articles that I would highly recommend you read, and I'll share the reference after. But at a maximalist level, I think what we can be doing in our schools as of yesterday, if not tomorrow, inshallah, is we begin to get involved in a action research model, a professional learning community. Call it what you want. It's a conversation amongst colleagues and educators in our school. One of my often critiques is that we're so consumed in the day-to-day requirements, again, the accountability measures, the compliance measures of our school, that we don't have a chance to slow down and reflect. We're very lucky in places like the UK and North America right now. You're entering your summer holidays. It's a time to really think about renewal. And I would highly recommend possibly starting up a reading group online with colleagues. Take a few articles like some of the ones that I'll suggest, and others that have been written by others that have done webinars in this series with the Muslim Teachers Network. But start a reading group and start planning, start thinking. Take an article like this one by Abdullah Trevathan, Spirituality in Muslim Education, Muslim Ethos in Muslim Schools. These are 2 different articles. And start reflecting on what does this mean for our schools, for our classrooms? What would an action look like that would be different? What am I going to try come September? Reflect on it, try it again, and continue this cycle of ongoing action research. This sense of reflective practice, if it's embedded in the culture of the school, will create that sense of presence in many ways at a school level, in terms of a school culture. At a minimalist level, what we can be doing is we can be establishing presence in our classrooms ourselves. And what I mean by that is, begin our own classes with a moment of reflection. Begin our own classes with a moment of sort of establishing the context of where we are in time and space. At the beginning of this webinar, I tried for myself, really, but I tried to reflect on the moment we're in within COVID, Black Lives Matter, which are both huge, junctures in our lives that we can't disregard. It'd be, for me to start a webinar and not acknowledge the fact that we're living in a particular time and space would be really difficult to sort of, do away with. And similarly for our students in our classrooms, for us to not see the big picture that they're living in and jump into, you know, the next chapter in the math textbook, it misses the point. So to preempt some of the challenges with presence, you know, respond to distraction with centeredness, respond to self-absorption with concern for others, and respond to stress or preempt stress, anxiety with calmness. And there's ways that we can be doing this. There's plenty of ways online that you could find ways of sort of establishing presence in your classroom, but I think that's one of the ways. Again, this is all in line with rethinking our Islamic schooling environment in relation to humility and hudûr. The other thing I would mention is I've been asked plenty of times, people say, but can we do this online? And I think hopefully I've shown just the way I started this webinar, which is one way, that you can do this whether you're online or in person. It's really just about what we say and how we say it. The second thing around minimalist, I would suggest, is to foster presence, this sense of hudûr, via story. Stories are powerful, especially for children, especially for young people. And we have far more stories available to us today than we did a decade ago as a sector of Islamic schooling. I've shared a few different ones here. The Islamic Schools League of America has an excellent online on their website on isla.org, I think it is. They have an excellent reading list that was done by Dr. Frida Shama that provides a long list of literature, from young children to, you know, secondary school, high school, of books and literature that you can be reading, poems, short stories, and the like. The Ghazali Children's Series, which most of you are probably familiar with, is another great resource. Noor Kids is another resource. There's tons out there. These are just a few, not meant to be exhaustive, but I'm just trying to make the point that there's a lot of story, a lot of really powerful narrative that can be shared with children during our courses, during our classes, as a way of reconnecting them. The third minimalist is, I think, foster presence, foster hudûr via dialogue. We're hearing a lot about dialogic work. Dr. Farah Ahmed has spoken extensively about this, and she likely did in the previous webinar that she did as well. And she's written a lot about dialogue as well. And so has Dr. Abdullah Shaheen. So, you know, look at the work that's been done on dialogue from an Islamic perspective. These are examples I've taken. The one on the left is from Yaqeen Institute in the United States that has these things called, what they call conversation cards. And these conversation cards are ways of sparking a discussion with students on topics that matter to them, relevant contemporary topics. The two examples on the right are from an Islamic school, an American curriculum Islamic school in Dubai, actually, that's using an inquiry-based learning approach called Next Generation School. And if you go to their website, you'll see a number of different things. But what they did is they've come up with inquiry-based questions for every grade level, as young as kindergarten, that connect Islamic values to the current context they're in. So they're asking about questions related to COVID and the pandemic in relation to their sense of Islamic values. Again, these are other ways of connecting the sense of connection, presence, without necessarily mandating a list of do's and don'ts. I'll close with this question, which is, what if humility defined the ethos of Islamic schooling? Jazakallah khairan. Looking forward to the conversation with questions, inshallah.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Dr. Nadeem Memon. And so if you missed the introduction at the beginning, Dr. Nadeem is a Canadian in Australia, mashallah, and I know it's quite late there, but inshallah we will be asking him a few questions before he goes, okay? And so as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have a question, you can either put your hand up or you can write the word speak in the box, which I always prefer, actually. It's a little bit neater. Sometimes I don't catch the hands going up. So if you write the word speak in the chat box, then I will come over to you. And if you have a question or a comment, inshallah, then I will come over to you. Let me just quickly check. Someone's got their hand up. Difficult to see. Okay. So if you have any questions, please write the word speak in the chat box. If not, I'm going to ask my own question. And that wouldn't really be fair. You've got the host asking all the questions. But I'll give an opportunity for you. Just going to give you another 10 seconds. If somebody's got a burning question. Okay. Verbal questions, please. Verbal questions are going to be preferred. Okay, yes, we've got one person. Two people. Okay, right. Okay, so we've got, let me go to Brother Ahmed first of all, and I'm going to unmute you. If you just, it'll be interesting to know where you're calling, where you're from. So I'm going to say where you're calling from, where you're from, and then pose your question or your comment, inshallah.
Barakallahu feek. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Yeah, my name's Ahmed. I'm from London, actually. I teach in a Muslim school, and it's a Muslim secondary school. And I just wanted to ask a very simple question. This concept of humility that we need to foster within our children in the school environment, what would you say are the practical steps that one can take immediately, the first steps that you would take towards engendering a sense of humility in our students? Obviously, you made an emphasis of it not being sort of rule-based in terms of the tarbiyah that we provide our students, not being rule-based, more like sort of a culture. What are the first steps towards creating that?
Mashallah, beautiful question. I think it begins by modeling it. I think it begins by modeling it. And what I mean by that is, if it becomes part of the culture amongst the staff, if it becomes part of the culture of something that the staff themselves are trying to become conscious of. I mean, we're all conscious of it, but I mean, we're reminded of it more regularly. We would then begin to start doing things specifically, so that students would acknowledge, would see it, even in our interaction with other staff members. If they see us doing certain things like, standing up for our elders, if there's an elder staff, bringing lunch, for sharing lunch with somebody, but just conscious actions of humility as a way of modeling this practice. I think it becomes, it then sort of, it rubs off. They say that even with tarbiyah, a lot of what tarbiyah is it rubs off, and that's the relationship we want to have. The essence of a student-teacher relationship is that you're amongst teachers whose good values and perspectives and ways of being are rubbing off on children. So we want to also become conscious of it.
Thank you so much. Let's go over to Brother Adnan. Brother Adnan, let's unmute you and try and unmute.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, brother. Jazakallah khair for your time and effort. My question is in terms of...
Where are you from, Brother Adnan?
Oh, sorry. I'm from London, and okay. I'm just using my lunch break to hear the conversation. I'm just wondering if you could let us know, in your own personal experience and research in the whole globe, give me any 2 or 3 examples of schools where I can go and spend time and see the theory in practice. Thank you. Jazakallah.
There's quite a few. I would prefer not to say the names because I would be limiting myself. I think in my own work, I've come across quite a few. And I think...
that's okay. You can mention my school. That's okay, Brother. I'm joking. You never visited my school before.
No, but just, in just about every school, you'll find nuggets of amazing things happening. And in every school that's real with themselves, you'll also find schools that are questioning what they can be doing more of. And that's exactly where we want to be. I wouldn't say I've ever walked into a school and I felt like this wasn't the right place. There's always goodness. There's some schools that are doing some really creative things outwardly, yeah, I think there's definitely a number of schools that are doing a lot of creative things, and there's many schools that I just haven't come across that that's kind of why I just don't want to share, because I'm pretty sure there's many others that I just haven't, wouldn't be justified to not share as many as I could.
Great. Okay, we've just suddenly had a surge in questions, so let's go to Sister. If I can ask Brother Charles, I'll come to you in a moment. If I can go to Sister Basma first, please. And I know Sister Basma's from London. Assalamu alaikum. Sister Basma, assalamu alaikum. Sister Basma, I'll try one more time. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Basma. Okay, if we can't go to her, then I will go to Brother Charles. So let's go to Brother Charles. And there you go. Let's unmute you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Brother Suleiman calling from Melbourne in Australia.
Yeah.
I'm interested. I was fortunate enough to work at a school called St. James in London for 10 years, and it was a multi-faith school, so not a Islamic school, but we established for many years practices of a formal pause at the beginning and the end of every lesson, and we had philosophy lessons where we would talk, and we established what we felt was quite a strong ethos within the school. One of the interesting things we found was that actually talking about the ethos and trying to define it intellectually sometimes proved more of a hindrance than a help. And in fact, it was the establishment of practices, and you mentioned it earlier about modeling behaviors, but also just simple practices. Our Year 8 boys would also serve lunch to teachers and the older students every day, little practices of service, practices of times of reflection. And it was in fact those routines and those practices that were more important, we felt, in the long run, rather than an intellectual understanding of the ethos. I'm just wondering what your views of that would be.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's important to acknowledge that, look, it's not going to look the same in every school, and it shouldn't, right? I think at a principle level, we recognize that something like humility, I think most of us probably say to ourselves, this makes a lot of sense. This should be an overarching principle or aspect of our school. How we define it would be from a school to school experience, and what it looks like in practice would also be very, very subjective. But I think that's the richness in it. And I think the way you describe what works in your school, it's brilliant. And not, for some schools, wanting to intellectually engage with what this might mean and defining it theoretically might be an exercise that they would welcome, and others would resist to it, which is fine as well. It doesn't have to always be in the same way, but I think the conversation is important.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go straight to Sister Basma. She's got her mic sorted this time.
Yeah, inshallah, I hope so.
Yes.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Firstly, Jazakumullah khair. Really, really appreciate the session. It's truly inspiring. Two very quick questions. Firstly, how we go about fostering humility in ourselves first before demonstrating it. And secondly, and more important to me, I've been thinking a lot about the dialogic questioning and inquiry-based learning, but I think one of the main stumbling blocks that I've observed here within parenting groups and educators in general is that often Muslim adults, they worry about encouraging questions. Why? Because maybe they feel that it might undermine their authority in classrooms, in particular, that children as they grow older broach challenging subjects that might be perceived as taboo or straying beyond what may be perceived boundaries religiously. Or even worse, that they'll expose certain shortcomings or practices in the adult's knowledge or in the educator that's present knowledge. So how would you go about, first of all, maybe perhaps reassuring or equipping educators, but this is something that's desirable and sometimes actually necessary.
Yeah. So maybe I'll answer the second question first. In terms of that sense of resistance toward an inquiry-based approach, I think educators need to be real with themselves and ask themselves that if we don't allow for the space to have these discussions, then who will? And and I think that's the bigger concern for us. Again, going back to the concept of tarbiyah and a sense of holistic education. If we don't listen to the things that are on the minds of our students, whatever they might be, and if we don't create a space for a safe discussion around these things, then we're doing a huge disservice, to their educational experience, because where else are they going to get information on this stuff? And the second thing is, yes, it is challenging. I can appreciate that there will be topics that come up that we don't always feel prepared for, but I think that's part of going back to the issue of humility. Is we're not supposed to be prepared for everything. So it turns back to us about our own sense of learning and exploring and being able to come up with an adequate, sufficient, supportive answer for ourselves and for our learners, which will likely come up again. I mean, once you do this, particular themes continue to recur in the minds of young people. So hopefully that answers it. To your first question about how do you foster a sense of humility amongst ourselves, I think that's, the spiritual struggle against the nafs is a struggle that we all endure, and I think there's been plenty written on it that that we can turn to. So I wouldn't venture into answering that myself. I don't think I'm qualified or anywhere near even conversant to be able to answer that. But there is plenty that we know in our tradition about fostering a sense of humility. Brother Babar, before we go to the next question, if I can I feel bad about the previous, there was a question 2 or 3 questions ago, I think Brother Ahmed, who asked about schools, and I don't think I answered that well enough. Maybe I should give a few specifics for the benefit of everyone, but I'll try to give names of schools that aren't in the UK. So there's and I already used one school in my slide deck, Next Generation School in Dubai. It's in Dubai, but actually the principal of that school is a close friend of mine from Toronto, from Canada, and he's doing some really amazing things there. And the reason I mentioned that school is because they have a public presence. They're all over the web. They're all over Twitter and social media. So there's a lot of resources that you can find of the things that they're doing around infusing an Islamic approach across their curriculum, and in particular around an inquiry-based approach. So Next Generation School in Dubai. And the other school I would mention that I've really been impressed by, and again also has a public presence, is Al-Fatih Academy in the United States. And again, they also have a public presence, and they've been doing some excellent work that they've been putting out on social media to share their perspective on a lot of what we're talking about. So if you're looking for resources, those are 2 schools that I think really resonate with me.
Great, thank you very much. Let's go straight to Ustad Idris Khamisa from all the way from South Africa. So let me unmute you first of all, and let's spotlight. Let's see your face as well. There you go. Assalamu alaikum. How are you doing?
Assalamu alaikum.
Oh, your mic. We can't. Your mic is on, but we can't hear you. Yeah, we can't seem to hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yes, we can hear your voice. MashaAllah. Thank you.
Anyway, Babar, it's always good to see your Mubarak face. And Dr. Nadeem, alhamdulillah, you know what can I say? It's such a joy to listen to you. May Allah increase you in your knowledge. And there are so many things that you said is so fundamental. And there are 2 aspects essentially that I would want you to comment on. One of the critical issues is, in the end, the whole idea of teachers having an authentic relationship with the students, so students could trust them, could value them. And that's one aspect, right? Now you find that is lacking. Now, how can we ensure that when we're hiring educators, they have this quality of authenticity and they love children? The second aspect that, if you will, is the whole idea, as someone mentioned early on, is to create a generation of students who are not passive receptacles, but they are moved to ask questions. They have doubts. They are not afraid to share those doubts. How can we create a culture in the classroom where teachers are not dominating the lessons, as it were, where pupils are stifled and not allowed to participate or to ask questions?
Well, first off, mashallah, Brother Idris, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for your questions. Really, these are questions you should be answering, not me, but you've asked them, so I'll give it a shot. Authentic relationship with students and hiring of teachers. Look, from my experience and from what I've seen in schools, it's hard. You can do different things in the hiring process, but I don't think it's as important as the induction of new educators into the school culture that you've fostered in your own school. So it's more so about creating a school culture that's nurturing, even for our educators, not just for our learners, but educators, that brings them into that rhythm of the school, of irrespective of what they come in with. They have an opportunity to grow as educators in this school context. And the brother who mentioned earlier about the school as the school culture established a sense of pause, for example, at the beginning of every class, that becomes part of the culture of the school. Now, irrespective of whether a teacher was accustomed to that or not prior to coming to the school, they become accustomed to it as part of the culture of the school they're now in. So I think it's more important about inducting new teachers into the culture that you would like to have in the school than getting it right during the hiring process, because that's obviously very difficult. In terms of fostering a culture of asking questions among students, I think it begins by us creating, as educators, us creating an opportunity for them to ask questions, and by modeling the questions themselves. So, if we start asking questions to ourselves, but also to the students in our classrooms of things related to the local context, the situatedness that they're in, the realities that they face, their learning becomes real, and they know that you've then opened up a door for them to talk about things that are outside of the textbook, outside of the curriculum. So I think we have to, again, lead by example, but ask those questions that we know are likely on the minds of the students.
Okay, thank you so much. We are running out of time, but I'm keen to get through as many questions as possible. Can we go to Sister Rosina, please? Sister Rosina, I've unmuted you, and also, there you go. Assalamu alaikum.
Hi, Brother Nadeem. I'm Rosina, calling from Texas, United States, and spent 15 years in Islamic schools, and currently a doctoral student at Columbia, studying teacher education. So my question to you, Brother Nadeem, is around how spirituality is conceptualized, right? It's fascinating. You talk about, we are dealing with Black Lives Matter, we're dealing with COVID, and then before we do anything, right, we have to attend to Hudür, right? And I wonder, and I just listened to a talk on liberation theology and the problem of this conception of spirituality being very confined within a colonialist framework. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, right? It's interesting. We talk about, well, we need to develop students' capacities to kind of speak to issues of the world, and that becomes separated from being grounded and gets separated from mindfulness. Can you speak a little bit to that? And I know things like embodiment, ideas like embodiment and values, and talking about what values look like in a certain situation or topic. If you can speak a little bit to some of that, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, look, I think we all know that the Islamic tradition has a rich tradition of spiritual practice and spiritual, a focus on spiritual growth. Tazkiyat al-nafs is an entire science. Purification of the soul, purification of the nafs, of the self, is an entire science. For us, unlike other spiritual traditions and spiritual theologies, the spiritual tradition in Islam is about moving closer to Allah and through our practice. Fasting, salah, all of these are spiritual practices that move us closer. And for us in Islamic schools, it's about acknowledging the ritualistic practices that are embedded in our faith tradition, but at the same time also recognizing that these ritualistic practices are intended to foster a sense of connectedness, and these two cannot be separated. I think what often happens is that we start doing salah, but we're not connected to the actual inner purpose of salah. And that's why I think what Abdullah Trevitan was speaking about in the chapters is when he says, for example, saying that we pray in our school and mandating prayer, for example, in school, and focusing more on the fact that students are not speaking and not running around during salah time and not creating a muck. We spend more time in managing salah than taking from the spiritual richness of the moment of salah. And that's, that again, this is why it has to begin from our classrooms. Before you even get to salah time, it has to begin in the culture of the school itself. And that's why the sense of presence, the sense of humility is all important, because when you get to salah, they should just see that, listen, if I'm not going to pray, or if I'm not going to pay attention, the least I can do is not disturb yours, right? But we're not even there yet. And that's where we want to get to. So hopefully that in a roundabout way provides some response to your question.
Thank you. Let's go straight to Sister Amal. So I will unmute you, Sister Amal. Okay, yes. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yes, go ahead, Sister.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Salam. Yes, we can. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from London.
Oh, London. Okay.
A lot of Londoners, I believe.
Okay, yes.
Sorry to take up your time. So, sorry, my hands are shaking. So, Bismillah. My first question, and I'm sorry if it sounds negative, but it's something that I've always wanted to ask the correct party, is that how can specifically girls' Islamic schools, which I have experience from as a student and as a teaching assistant, I would say, so not a main educator, how can girls' Islamic schools specifically reduce the emphasis on outward Sunnan in a way that is balanced with the inward Sunnan that you mentioned? And how can female educators, they have a distinctive way of religious reprimanding of girls, which I've observed is to be quite unpleasant, and I've witnessed that, unfortunately. How can these types of schools begin to address humility when alienation that you speak about is established during the enrollment phase? And shouldn't they realize that Muslims as a whole, they're not carbon copies of each other, and acknowledge that families wishing to educate their children may not be what they expect on enrollment? Jazakallah khair, barakallahu fikum.
It's a very, very important question, and a real, I think, reality that many of our schools face. So I'm glad you've raised it. I'm sure there's multiple ways of looking at this, and probably many different answers that we could probably get into. I think my first response to this is, I think if a school focuses on the inward, that would be a good starting point. So I think what you're asking is, how do we reduce the focus on the outward? But I don't think that would be reducing the focus on the outward would likely cause resistance amongst many people, because the outward practices of our deen are an essential definitive factor for, if not all Islamic schools, if not many, all Islamic schools define, this outward practice as being essential for many people. So just so we don't ruffle any feathers, at least creating more of a emphasis on the inward and bringing attention to the inward over time will, inshallah, begin to shift this balance. And I think it'll be a softer way of doing it than sort of butting heads and changing the discourse. Like I know there was an Islamic school, there was an Islamic school that I was working with in Canada, and they were talking about very strict policies on the haircuts that boys were allowed to have. Again, all about the outward, right? It wasn't focused on. There was another school that we were working with in Australia, and they were thinking about making salah optional because students were not paying attention. Just it was becoming exhausting to get students to just stop for Salatul Zuhr and really pay attention and not disturb others. And they said, let's make it optional. Again, these types of sort of drastic changes can sometimes create resistance in ways that you don't really want off the cuff. But what you do want is you want to begin to shift the attention toward the inward and then begin to get some balance.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we've unusually gone over time, but I want to include the final two questions, if that's okay, Dr. Nadeem. You're okay? You're not? I know it's nighttime there, but you're not falling asleep.
No, I'm good.
You? No,
I'm okay.
You've had your coffee.
I naturally look tired, but I'm okay.
No, that's fine. Okay, so let's go to Sister Maria, please. Let's go to Sister Maria. I've unmuted you. Or trying to unmute. Sister Maria, if you click on your unmute button. If not, then we'll move to the next person. Try that again. Okay, it doesn't seem to be working. If it works, if you can cut, okay, well, let's go to the next person. If it works, then we'll come back to her. Let's go to Ustad Akram Chima, please. Assalamu alaikum.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Even better if we could see you.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Nadeem. And it's wonderful to hear. This is work in progress, isn't it? That's what we've been saying. All of us are trying our best to find ways in which we can inculcate the sort of, to establish the ethos, to inculcate the right behavior, the right sort of attitudes and values into our children for the future generations, make them leaders of tomorrow, so that all the things that you've shared with us today can be implemented and become a reality. So really my question to you is this business of humility, if you relate it to idea of gaining self-esteem, gaining self-confidence, these are two things that are really juxtaposed as a question for all of us. How do we ensure that our children have the self-esteem and the self-confidence in themselves, at the same time have the humility? Because it's related to your call to Allah. It's all about really recognizing that you are significant and yet you are insignificant. You are as significant as a bit of sand in the desert, and yet you are significant because Allah created you. And I want every child to recognize, because Allah created you, you are wonderful and you are absolutely beautiful, and you can achieve anything you want. That sort of self-confidence, self-esteem has to be there. Part of the humility is to recognize how to establish these both, and that I think is work in progress. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and you know this sector far better than I do. Mashallah, it's an honor just to be having this conversation with you, Uncle. But absolutely, I think there has to be a balance between this self-confidence and humility. I think our prophetic model of our Prophet ﷺ gives us that sense of balance between the two. But I think part of how this self-confidence can be fostered is through this sense of humility, because young people who have a deep sense of humility will recognize that this is part and parcel of their tradition, of who they are as Muslims. Like you said, knowing that you're significant and yet insignificant at the same time, and then recognizing that our Prophet ﷺ showed extreme levels of confidence at times when needed, and extreme levels of humility at times, at all times. But it's this constant inner balance. But I think it's an excellent point to raise, and one that we should always be cognizant of.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. I think we're going to draw this to a close now because we've already gone over. I know that there are a couple more people that wanting to ask questions, but there are some microphone issues. But let's call it a day, inshallah. I think. Thank you so much, Dr. Nadeem, for your contribution. I know it's almost impossible to cover everything within a short space of time, and these webinars aren't meant to cover everything. The idea is that we want to kind of spark, an interest during these webinars, and that there is an opportunity for further reading and further study. So that's probably the final question, really. Where now then? For everyone that's watching now, we had nearly 100 people, mashallah, in the room, and when we put it online, we'll have a few hundred more. Where now in terms of further study? You mentioned Dr. Abdullah Trevathan. Where can we, some of the works there, perhaps your book as well. What can our audience do now? And also, a couple of them are asking for your email address. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I can type my email address. I can say my email address here, but it's Nadeem.Memon. Yeah.
Probably better to type, I'd say.
UniSA. I'll type it. In terms of where now, let me just I definitely think, as I mentioned about the maximalist approach, I think, taking something, reading it, reflecting on it, reading things or listening to webinars, they just spark ideas, they spark conversation. So I think it's really important within your schools to find some sort of a resource that you feel resonates, and take it to your staff and have conversations around it. And a lot of these types of concerns, the richness of the potential of our schools comes out through the collaborative thinking that we can bring together in our schools. So the challenge for us is we don't have enough time, as I mentioned earlier, to even have these conversations. But I think webinars like this are proving that there's a thirst for these types of conversations. And if we have these in our schools and then across schools, through organizations like Nida Trust, inshallah, we will gain some collective momentum.
Inshallah. Okay. So just to end by thanking our audience members for sticking past the 1 hour. Thank you so much. And inshallah, we hope that you will join us again next week at the slightly later time of 4 o'clock UK time. And inshallah, we will have another special guest speaker, Sister Asma Klaassen, who's an expert in education and identity from ISBO in the Netherlands. And she will be talking about pathways to positive identity development amongst Muslim youth. I'm really looking forward to that one, inshallah. So once again, thank you. And also thank you to Dr. Nadeem Memon, inshallah. Inshallah, we hope to invite you back again. All right.
Thank you.
Shukran. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Take care and be safe.